Hi, my name is Justin DeReese with the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, and I'm here with Chuck Connor, our CEO, who is going to give a political outlook today. Chuck, how are you doing?
Well, Justin, thank you. And folks, it's a real pleasure for me to join you today. Obviously, this is a very poor substitute for what would normally be our time together, where we gather in Washington to really advocate and educate people on the value of farmer-owned cooperatives. And that is something we're going to miss very, very much this year. Nevertheless, we have been working hard. Obviously, this has been an incredibly busy time in Washington, as it has been all over the country as people deal with these issues before us. And we look forward to sharing some of those with you today. And our staff looks forward to bringing you up to speed on everything that's been going on in Washington and how that relates to your businesses. And we continue to hope to do that in a way that makes your job a little bit easier out there in the field, because I know we are in very challenging times. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, it is an honor for me to have this opportunity to appear before you, albeit in a very different form than anything I am used to, and certainly in a different form than what you might typically see me in these kind of times. You will recall that we were last together as a large group on February 11th of 2020 during the NCFC annual meeting in California. And it was on February 11th that I gave my last Washington update on the state of play in politics and what was going on in this town. And you know, it's really unusual that it's now June, and this is the next time that I'm having that opportunity. In a typical year, I suspect between your meetings and events scheduled all over the country, I would have given an update like this probably anywhere between 12 to 16 times between now and then. But the last time that I spoke on this topic was February 11th of 2020. And that in today's world just seems like a real eternity ago. I mean, obviously it wasn't too long after we returned from our annual meeting that the COVID-19 virus began to take hold. And, you know, within a few short weeks after that, NCFC's offices at 50 F Street were closed. Myself and all of our team have been working virtually, as have many of you since that time. Let's take a look at just how things can change over time. When I gave that last update on that February 11th day, Bernie Sanders was the leading Democrat in the nomination for President of the United States. And, you know, we look back today and that almost seems funny, but when we were gathered in California, it was almost a given that Bernie had this thing locked down. And I remember in those remarks that I shared with you, I talked about Joe Biden, and I compared Joe Biden's campaign to the campaign of Jeb Bush in 2016. When, as you recall, Jeb Bush, who was probably the most seasoned candidate in the race, never really got off the ground and was sort of out very quickly. And I compared Joe Biden's campaign then to Jeb Bush, because it appeared that despite all the experience that Biden had, that his campaign had a very, very rough road ahead of it. Remember Michael Bloomberg? Bloomberg at that particular time was spending a fortune, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in order to capture the nomination. And many of us, and I will put myself in that same category, we thought that his campaign was going to take root and that he might well be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. And now we almost forget who Michael Bloomberg is, of course. Now, obviously, at that particular time, you had the moderates and the left wings of the Democratic Party that were really sort of engaged in almost a holy war. And again, at that particular time, the Bernie Sanders wing seemed to have a strong foothold, and Michael Bloomberg was trying to be a little bit more moderate, and Joe Biden was just sort of floating around, not at that point uncertain sort of where he fit in all of that. You know, that was a high time of uncertainty in the Democratic Party. And of course, I spoke about President Trump and his attempt to get reelected. And obviously, I said at that particular time that his campaign was going to be based almost solely on the state of the economy and on the fact that at that time we had record low unemployment across our country. My folks, how things do change over time. And again, that was just 4 months ago, but I know, like you, for us at NCFC, that seems like in many ways almost a generation ago. Obviously, the deal breaker, the game changer, if you will, in this circumstance was the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't too long after we returned from California that our offices would be closing down. I remember telling our folks, that we were doing this for 2 weeks and then we'd reevaluate. Obviously, 2 weeks has turned into 4 months, and we're not close to reopening at this stage here in Washington by any means. I remember at our annual meeting, several people made predictions about what was coming down the road in the future. And of course, it seems like the qualifier that everyone makes when they try and do a prediction down the road is they say, barring some kind of black swan event. Well, guess what? There's no barring the black swan event. We hit it. It hit us, if you will, squarely between the eyes, and we're still in the midst of perhaps one of the largest black swan events that we have had in the history of this country and its impact. And of course, that has also been touched upon by the horrible circumstances that are going on around the country in terms of the battle between our police forces and minorities across our country. And this is, just a horrible thing that has to sort itself out and has to get righted before any kind of normalcy comes back to circumstances out there. If one wasn't enough to have all of these things going on at the same time, it's just a very, very challenging time for us that no one would have even remotely predicted 4 months ago. So today, we roll the ball forward, and guess what? Despite all of my comparisons, Joe Biden is the nominee for president of the United States. And obviously Donald Trump is seeking re-election, and that is no surprise to any of us. I will just say, relative to the Biden campaign, he finished well. It shows, you sort of are never out of these things. And his ability to navigate between the more moderate part of the Democratic Party and the more liberal part of the Democratic Party was impressive down the stretch. And because he was impressive at that, ultimately he was able to not only knock out Sanders, but to survive all of the onslaughts that came at him as a result of the money spent from Mayor Bloomberg and others as well. And so, this is a very strong battle between two very, very seasoned people. Obviously, the president is always seasoned, but Joe Biden has served in many, many capacities in many different ways, including being our vice president. And so, his resume is probably one of the most extensive for this job that you possibly could. I will tell you that I think Biden is being helped greatly right now by the fact that, as a country, we're still somewhat in shutdown. I think there was an article in the Washington Post last week that really sort of reflected the views that I've had now for several weeks and several months, and that is Biden does better, when he can sort of run a low-profile sort of campaign, a campaign where people don't necessarily look at what he is saying at this very moment, but sort of look at him as the seasoned politician that he is and has been, over the course of an entire career. And he fares well in that kind of environment. And for all practical purposes, the Post article points out, Biden just sort of needs to hold his own, and Trump is really sort of battling against himself in this presidential race. And, how does that end up being positive or negative for the president? We don't know, obviously, the outcome of that, but this is more of a battle between Trump himself, and Biden just simply has to, to stay on the sidelines and let all that play out. And that seems a little bit to be the strategy of their campaign, during these kind of times. And I think it's probably an effective one, and we will talk a little bit more about that. Despite the fact that we have now sorted through things, folks, and have a Democratic nominee after a very bruising primary process, and obviously there were a few candidates who thought they might be interested in taking on Trump in the Republican primary, and those were very, very short-lived, and I think I predicted that. But despite having sorted through all of this, I will tell you that I have spoken about this at previous events as well. I believe our political system in this country is really on the verge of breaking apart, collapsing, however you want to describe it. Things are a mess in Washington right now, and we saw that play out, in presidential politics. And I know they're not going to get any better. And as I, foreshadow the November elections for president coming up, I know it's going to be an ugly process. I know at the end of the day, there will be a very, very large group of people who won't even try and validate the results of the election. They will just simply find some reason to question the outcome. And, again, that's not even knowing who the winner or loser is going to be. But, our system in general is in very, very rough shape right now. And it's a difficult environment to be, to provide a rational voice, particularly a rational voice for rural America in this kind of environment. I will just say that one thing that hasn't changed since February, and really hasn't changed, I think, in the last several years, is there continues to be a great divide here between the electorate and in terms of demographics across this country. And if you know somebody's background, you oftentimes have a very, very good idea of how they're going to vote in a presidential election. And this chart that I have before you again kind of shows that. It's probably one of the bigger challenges for the Republican Party that exists out there, and that sort of older white evangelicals are, continue to be the political base of the Republican Party. Younger folks are tending to go the other direction. And so as people, the elderly are dying off and moving out of our voting blocks, Republicans are not doing a very good job of backfilling what has been their traditional political base. Obviously, Republicans continue to have a major, major problem with women, and you can see that from the lower part of this graph as well, where if you're a college graduate and a woman, there's a 2 in 3 chance that you're going to vote for a Democratic candidate, vote for Joe Biden in this particular circumstance. And again, you can see out there Republicans just doing very, very poorly with minorities as well in this circumstance. So that's, again, kind of the breakout. That's why a lot of times when you see a particular candidate in the commercials they may be running, you may look at that and say, I'm not sure who they're talking to. Well, they may not be talking to you, because the demographics are pointing them in a sort of different kind of direction than what we may always be looking for. But this data is pretty telling in terms of where things are headed down the road. So just a few, again, key indicators that I think are going to have a tremendous impact on us as we go forward towards our presidential elections. I mentioned earlier that in February, President Trump was fully engaged and working on a campaign based upon the state of the economy. At that particular time, the unemployment rate was 3.6%. Most people say that's as low as you can possibly go. That's sort of full employment, if you will, in the United States. Today, that unemployment rate stands in May at 13.3%. So it has increased fourfold. No longer is President Trump in a position to in effect run on the basis of the economy that he has created. And he has had to go and retool a lot of what he has said in the past based upon the consequences of COVID-19. These right track and wrong track data, which are always very important in terms of people's general attitude and how they feel about the candidates. As you can well imagine, in February, the wrong trackers were still strong, and even those February numbers were historically low for politicians at 38%, but they've dropped again dramatically. Basically, just 1 in 4 Americans believe that we're on the right track going forward, and those are pretty telling numbers. Always bad news for incumbents running for re-election, because when people generally, if they say things are really on the wrong track, they're far less likely to vote for the person who's been there, in effect having an influence on the current circumstance that they don't like. So politicians track these numbers pretty closely. President's approval rating, another important factor. The disapproval rating as well. As you can see, depending on your circumstance, in February, pretty much President Trump was evenly split with slightly more disapprovals. That has been typical Trump numbers, sort of throughout his first campaign and throughout his presidency, but his approval and disapproval rates have widened here, as you might expect, as well as a result of COVID-19. And people are obviously looking for someone to blame for all this. And sort of head-to-head matchups of Trump versus Biden, as you can see in February, Biden showed a lead. That lead hasn't necessarily widened for Biden. As I said, this is more about Trump versus Trump, but the president's own supporters are thinning out a little bit. We're going to talk more in a minute. These numbers are always, at this stage of the process, based upon registered voters. When we get into the circumstance of likely voters, these numbers become a little bit more important, but they're still consequential out there in terms of which direction the president may be trending. And right now he is trending a little bit downward in that regard. The last 3 months as well, we've seen so much turmoil in our political system. One of the sort of carryover turmoil pieces, if you will, I mentioned there will be a lot of people out there that that won't even validate the next election, no matter who wins that circumstance. But one of the things in that validation process that we always have to remember is, we don't elect based upon popularity. We don't elect based upon the popular vote. We elect based upon the Electoral College. And in order to be the president of the United States, you need to win 270 Electoral College votes to be the president of the United States. And again, this is very, very important, as several of our last presidential elections have not been decided by the popular vote, but by the Electoral College instead. And it's going to be a huge factor in this year's race as well. In February, I told you guys that, one of the things that if I were advising President Trump, one of the things that makes you nervous is that for all practical purposes, President Trump only has one path whereby he could be elected the president of the United States, and he has one path to get reelected as president of the United States. And that path on an Electoral College basis basically means that he has to take the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as he did in 2016. If he stubs his toe and doesn't do that in one of those states, for all practical purposes, mathematically, there's no second pathway for him becoming president. In other words, there's no margin of error in that. Somebody can't mess up in the state of Michigan and not get the vote out properly. Anything goes wrong, that's President Trump's one path toward reelection. In those same remarks, I said the Democrat, on the other hand, in this case now Joe Biden, has multiple paths. And certainly for Joe Biden, the path number one, whereby he becomes the president of the United States, is in effect the counter opposite of Trump's path. If he can stop Trump and create, sort of that blue wall in one of those three states and pick up one of those states, he will be the next president of the United States. You think Joe Biden isn't focusing a lot of campaign attention on Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, you are crazy. I mean, this is where all resources, all efforts are being focused at this point, because again, one of those states falls, Trump mathematically really cannot be president of the United States. Democrats, and in this case Joe Biden, have a second advantage in that there is another path for them whereby a Democrat can get elected president, and that's what's generally referred to as the Sun Belt strategy, aka Florida. If Republicans don't win Florida, a Republican candidate cannot be president of the United States. Again, that's sort of the mathematical equation. You take Florida out and all their electoral votes, Republicans cannot win. So if Biden wins Florida, it doesn't matter. Trump could go back and win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan and still not be the president of the United States without Florida. Again, just to repeat, no Republican can be president of the United States without winning Florida. And that's where the math sort of lies, given the times that we're in. And again, that's a challenge for the president of the United States. He's got to sweep the tables. Democrats don't have to sweep the tables. They just simply need to have a good night. As you can see in any scenario, and you guys have heard me talk about this before, there's only a handful of states that really determine the outcome of the presidential election. States like my home state of Indiana and some of the states where each one of you may reside, we probably won't see a lot of presidential campaigning activity just because the outcome of the election for president in 2020 has been known in vast majority of the states across the country for a very, very long time. And as you can see, there's 6 or 7 states here that are totally up for grabs. No surprise, Florida is on there, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, all, as I've mentioned. Nebraska is on there, and that's 1 electoral vote. So I suspect Nebraska probably ultimately goes for Trump, but I was thinking about this earlier when I saw Nebraska listed now as a toss-up state. When I first started working in the Senate in the 1980s, Nebraska was represented by 2 Democratic senators. So, things are changing out there, and they're always dynamic in the world of politics. So you never absolutely know for sure. But one thing we do know is that very few states are going to get the vast majority of the resources in the presidential campaign going forward. So as we move forward toward those all-encompassing November elections, and the presidential election in particular, I'll note a few things for you. I mentioned earlier that some of the data I was showing was based upon registered voters. And in the world of politics, registered voters really don't mean a whole lot, maybe other than establishing some trends here and there. It's really once you start seeing polls being taken among people that they have determined to be very, very likely to vote. And when those polls start coming out, more than likely, I think the presidential race tightens up for the most part, but it really becomes a better barometer upon which we can make predictions on the outcome of these things. Because again, if you're not going to vote, it doesn't matter what your political views are out there. And I wish everybody voted, obviously, but the key is when we start seeing surveys among people that are very, very likely and have a established history of voting. Again, I expect that to show that this is going to be a battle royale all the way down to the finish line. Obviously, we've noted as well the gender gap, the difference between men and women. This is just, again, a real problem for Republicans in general, but the president of the United States in particular. Shocking that Joe Biden holds a much wider lead among women than what Hillary Clinton did when she ran against Trump. And again, I think that probably is bad news for the president and reflects a little bit of it may not be Joe Biden as much as it is, Donald Trump himself in terms of that verdict going forward. And part of the recent movement in the polls is among voters over 65, something the president is watching very, very closely and something that probably has him and his campaign advisors concerned. The over 65s right now, they're obviously in the high risk category for COVID-19. They're just very, very nervous. And they're part of that group that basically believes now that the country is moving in the wrong direction just because they're scared, and in some cases scared for their own life. Many of those have moved out of the Republican, out of the Trump camp, and are now undecided and perhaps even leaning towards Biden. And remember what I said earlier, Republicans cannot win the White House without Florida. Think about the percentage of over 65 vote that exists in the state of Florida, and you can see why this is something that is very, very worrisome to the president of the United States, and a trend that he's going to have to buck here a little bit over the next several months before the November elections. Obviously, in November, it's not just all about the president, although that's a huge part of what's going on in our political world. But obviously, the battle for the Senate is going to be up for grabs. Who controls the Senate? And obviously, you guys know that right now, Republicans have a somewhat slim majority in the Senate, 53 to 47. The impact of this is huge, if nothing else, in that the president of the United States has had a record number of judges confirmed in the last 3 or so years during the Trump presidency, and that simply would not have happened if Republicans didn't control the Senate. He probably would have virtually no judges confirmed. So, this is a key battle line going forward in terms of who controls the Senate. As you can see from this particular graph, I would just particularly note you to the gold-colored states. Those are states where it's a toss-up election. as you can see in states like Colorado and North Carolina and Maine. These are states that are held by Republicans that make up that majority. Frankly, in all three of those states, the incumbent Republican is probably quite a bit behind in the polls, particularly in Colorado and North Carolina. And so, you know, the potential here for a change of control in the Senate is strong, given the vulnerability of these candidates. And, you know, this will have enormous consequences for us, and certainly enormous consequences for the next president of the United States going forward, because, again, the Senate is so closely divided. I would just say in the Senate as well, to remind you, you know, we think about these things every time because of how closely divided the Senate is. If the Senate were to somehow end up at 50-50, of course, the vice president is the tiebreaker, and whoever party the vice president belongs to, they have control of the Senate in that circumstance. And this is something that, again, could be a very, very strong possibility in the November elections. In the House of Representatives, the Republicans really do need something pretty dramatic in order to take back control of the House, which they lost 2 years ago. Right now, Democrats have a 233 to 197 presidential or an advantage in the House. You know, it would take a major wave from Trump, I think, in order to carry enough Republicans through in order to switch the House back to the Republican Party. I say that on this next chart, as you can see, sort of who's vulnerable and who's not. It's 435 members of the House of Representatives. Not very many are actually, you know, in a vulnerable state, as this list shows, but there's enough that it's substantial here. And in the last election, there were a lot of freshman Democrats that came, you know, into the Congress of the United States, first elected to Congress. And as you can imagine, while they're, you know, in their first term and while they're sort of getting their sea legs, they're all generally considered pretty vulnerable members. And so the list of toss-up races for the Democrats is quite a bit longer than the Republican list, mainly just because we have all these freshman Democrats who came in and, you know, they've been targeted by Republicans to possibly switch them back to the Republican Party as well. So we'll see how the House turns out. But again, I sort of stay by my prediction that it would take a major wave from Trump, I think, in order to carry enough House Republicans through in order to switch this thing back to the Republican Party going forward. So some of our takeaways for 2020, the developments between now and the November election. Typically by this point, you know, there's a lot of things that sort of seem to happen that kind of fall into place. And I'm not saying the results of the election are known by any means, but typically a lot of those pieces are starting to fall into place. I think given the uncertainty that we have been in with COVID-19, with all the rioting that is taking place around the country and still ongoing, there's just a strong sense of uncertainty that exists out there. And I think the events and the happenings, if you will, between now and the November election are really sort of going to drive the results of this election. And I don't want to say everything that's happened up to this point will be for naught, but it'll be less impactful in my view than what's going to happen going forward here over the next several months. I think those choices and impacts will be substantial in the final outcome of this. And we certainly know that the 2020 race for president is going to be the most competitive incumbent race since George H.W. Bush ran in 1992 for the Republicans. And so this one is going to attract a lot of attention and a lot of resources, particularly if you are in one of those swing states. And again, for us as representatives of farmers and farmer co-ops, I will just tell you that all of this uncertainty and all of the swing state movement that exists out there, so much of that battle is occurring in rural America. And this does provide us, folks, with the opportunity to really attract a lot of attention for our issues out there and our advocacy in your behalf, our advocacy in behalf of your farmer owners. With all of the craziness and with all the uncertainty, we're well positioned to be impactful in your behalf. And that excites me, and I know it excites the entire team at NCFC. So just know that We may not be able to make every prediction that has occurred out there, as I have demonstrated between February and now. But one thing that will not change is our ability to use this uncertainty in a way that is positive for farm policy, for food policy, is I think, ripe, and we will have that impact. I'm very, very confident of that. I just want to review very, very quickly with you. I am excited for each one of you to listen to the reports from all of our congressional team, because they have recapped in detail a lot of what we have been working on. I think most of you know that we have not been idle during the last 3 to 4 months of the COVID-19 shutdown. This has been probably maybe the busiest time of my career, and I know I speak on behalf of the entire NCFC team in stating that. Working from home has basically meant just less hours on the road, more hours working, and there's just been so much going on. And I think we have had a tremendous impact on a lot of the policies that have come forth as a result of COVID-19, including early on the declaration of all of agriculture being an essential workforce. Think about, folks, the consequences if that would have gone a different direction, and what that would have meant to spring planting and food supply and distribution and livestock production and everything else that could have occurred. That, we could have easily been shut down. And many of you have heard me say that in that first draft that came out of the Department of Homeland Security, we were not an emergency designation, a critical designation. So we feel good about the work that we were able to do in steering things in the right direction there. We feel good about our work in terms of the help that is getting out there to producers. There's a lot of problems out there, and we know there's a lot of work to be done, but help is flowing, farm aid is flowing through the coronavirus assistance program. We know we've got a lot of questions on those, and we've been working through many of those that you've been sending our direction. But again, very, very impactful time in terms of that relief. Small Business Administration, PPP program. I suspect we have put out 20 to 25 issue briefs on that program alone to try and make sure you guys had all the tools you need to make smart and wise decisions going forward. So Lisa Van Dorn's update video will give you a lot more information, a lot more detail on that as well. Throughout all of this, folks, if you would have told me when this crisis broke that we could go through this time and not have a major, what I would describe as a major disruption in the availability of H-2A workers to serve agriculture in this country, I would have thought that was impossible. But yet that's what we've achieved in your behalf. There are a few isolated circumstances out there, but for the most part, we've gotten the same number of workers across the border and through a system that for all practical purposes was shut down. But yet we were able to put emergency procedures in place and get those workers to you. Mary Nowak's update again gives you a full roundup of that as well. And finally, in the category of the issue that is probably going to drive me to an early grave, and that is our 199A discussions with the Department of Treasury. I am very agitated by this, just to be perfectly frank, because we thought we were making a good and right decision by not pressuring Treasury relative to their proposed rule during the time of the COVID-19 crisis. Our general view and the feedback we were getting was that the Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin and all his senior people were really overwhelmed by the crisis and trying to salvage the economy and keep things from just spinning out of control. And we didn't want to be sort of, the dog in the manger, sort of out there, hammering on our individual issue. And so I thought we were safe in doing that. And that's a call we made to sort of give some reprieve there. And in the midst of that reprieve that we gave them, they snuck in there and put forward a rule to the Office of Management and Budget that works very much against us. And again, Marlis has got the full briefing on that, but I am agitated by their decision to go forward on this. And we continue to fight this strongly in your behalf, and just know that we haven't given up, but it's a very, very tough fight in front of us on this. In wrapping up, I just want to again kind of look forward to the future a little bit, because despite everything that has happened, we are very, very excited about the challenges that are before us going forward. I will just name a few here. There are many, but just some to highlight for you. We know that in the next, there is going to be another pandemic relief package of some kind. The House has already passed one. The Senate is working on one. Something is going to happen here. And we hope that as a result of another pandemic effort in the Congress, that we will be successful in working with some of our partners and getting further relief on the employer pension circumstance. You will recall that that was one of our big victories from last year that saved a lot of money for some pensions that many of you hold. We're trying to broaden that effort to touch additional pensions here. In our view, particularly during a time of COVID-19, your pension contributions, particularly those related to the premiums of the PBGC, should not be something that's taking money out of your pocket to a point where you're struggling to keep your employees in check. And that just simply shouldn't be. We think we've got a lot of support in Congress, again, to get some of this further relief, and we're going to be working on that. I will tell you as well that throughout this crisis, we have realized firsthand just how fragile our food supply is. In some ways, it's been resilient, and we're so thankful, that food has been available throughout this time of crisis. But boy, there's been, some bumps in the road that on some days I weren't sure we were going to survive those bumps, including the spread of the disease among, the meat packing sector and that sort of thing. These were real challenges. We want to use this as a learning opportunity going forward in the future. And we have been engaged with Aimpoint, again, the folks that have served us so well, to try and put together a team of folks. And we have reached out to many of our colleagues, including the likes of Farm Bureau and others, to try and put together a new study that basically assesses what went wrong and what went right in this COVID-19 crisis. But main thing is, how do we avert this, and how do we make our system more resilient going forward? So if, we get a repeat, we're better equipped to handle this in a way that does not produce the economic calamity for us that occurred this year. And finally, if we talk about black swans, we're also in the same context talking about green swans. And what do I mean by green swan? Many of you have heard me talk about climate change. And again, particularly driven by the outcome of the election, we just know that at some point when things return to normal, climate is going to be a big issue. No matter who's in charge, I believe that Congress is going to pass comprehensive climate legislation. And I think for us, the fundamental question is that with us or is that without us? And obviously, we want to be at the table when they do this. American agriculture is a key component in the climate change debate. We don't want to have done to us. We want to participate in what is being done to us. And I think there's many positive ways that climate change can be actually an economic driver for farmers and ranchers across America. And we're part of a coalition. We're actually leading this coalition that is indeed looking at these very issues. We don't have policy recommendations yet, but we're working on some, and we're looking at things, and we'll be sharing those with a lot of you and seeking your input, because again, we don't want to have this done to us. We want to be at the table and a part of the solution in a way that is good for farmers and good for co-ops going forward. Well, again, thank you all for this chance to give you an update on what has been happening in Washington. Obviously, it's a lot, and we're very dominated by the fall midterm elections, which will determine our leadership not only for 2 and 4 years to come, but perhaps for a very long time going forward. These are important elections. Everything that is going on in Congress today is important to your bottom line. And I appreciate the opportunity you've given us to represent you, to be a part of that, and to work in your behalf. And just know that whatever it is you need us to be doing, we're here to serve your interest and look forward to that opportunity.